Okay, Tashi Delek, welcome back after our little break, and hopefully you enjoyed that time and had some good practice time during that time as well. I wanted to start by just doing a little bit of a review, just to kind of catch up again on where we are in this whole process. As we started off the initial part one, we did a little bit on the history of Buddhism and in terms of India and Tibet, some of the basic principles and so forth. And then we also began looking at the path of individual liberation. And then as we moved into part two, we completed that and did the path of the Bodhisattva. And then in part three, we've been looking at the path of Tantra. And we began with the preliminary practices called Nundro, and both the common and uncommon Nundro practices. And so we've been doing that. So now in part four, we're continuing on. The next stage in the way that these practices are normally taught is the generation stage practices. And so we'll be moving into the generation stage practices in this class. And as we go through that, we start off with some Shamata, back where we started in the very beginning. And we go through some incremental steps. I like the way that Padmasambhava laid this out. And because it's very incremental in moving into the visualizations associated with the generation stage where we generate or visualize the deity. And so that's a very nice way of moving into that. And we'll get involved in some of the more advanced basic deity practices, some more advanced deity practices, as well as some supplemental things that go along with doing those practices, some of the advanced aspects, using the drum and bell and so forth as a part of that. So that's where we are. And then the next parts, there will be two more parts that deal with the completion stage and two more parts that deal with Dzogchen. And so that's kind of where we are in the overall process of development in the practices. So in terms of this is the second training. Remember the three trainings? We had the training on ethics, and then we had the training on meditation. So this is training on meditation is where we are in terms of that format. And then the last one is the training on wisdom, which we will get to much later. In fact, we'll get to that toward the end of the completion stage practices. So that's a ways off yet. But we're focused on the meditation training. And in this part, we are beginning with some Shamata practices. Then we will move into some practices called outer Tantra. And so we have outer Tantra and inner Tantra that are a part of that. Those are the two main categories of Tantra practices. And so the outer Tantras involve visualizing the deity as generally outside of us, hence outer Tantra, whereas the inner Tantras, we visualize ourselves as the deity. Now, a lot of these kind of cross over, so you may start out visualizing the deity outside of you and then they merge in with you, for example. So it's not a real clear-cut difference between the two, but that's a general difference. Other differences, the outer Tantras tend to deal with peaceful deities. They're generally seated on a moon disk, or perhaps standing, but almost always seated. They also tend to be single deities. We don't see them, for example, in union with a consort, the way we do in the inner Tantras. And so the inner Tantras, then, we do have the wrathful form. We see them engaged with a consort, oftentimes, not always, but a lot of the time. And they are typically either seated or quite often actually standing in this form on a sun disk as opposed to a moon disk. Or you might see both. You might have a sun disk on top of a moon disk. That is also very common in terms of how that is set up. Now, in a few cases, it will be just a female deity, like Vajrayogini, Vajravarahi, Simamukha. There's a lot of them. And they may be holding a staff called a Khatvanga. And that Khatvanga symbolically represents their consort. So even though they're not pictured in union with the consort, the Khatvanga is a symbolic representation of having a consort. Now, the outer deity yogas are further subdivided into three categories. And so the first of those categories is called Performance Tantra. And the idea of Performance Tantra is that it tends to focus on purification of karma. And it's called Kriya Yoga, K-R-I-A. The second category is called Action Tantra, or UPA, U-P-A. And the third one are just called the Yoga Tantras. Now, the difference is best described in terms of the first and third categories, because the second one is kind of a halfway in between the other two. And so I already described the performance category, and the basic idea involved there includes things like, in addition to purification of karma, our body, speech, and mind, that also involves things like the absolute and relative truths. The two truths are visualized as separate or understood as being separate from each other. Later on, some of the others, they're not. The deity visualization is one in which we visualize the deity as kind of a Lord-servant relationship. They're kind of a superior and we're inferior to them. And then when we get into the Action Tantra, it's pretty much the same, but the deity is understood as being more like a friend or a helper. And so then when we get into the third one, the Yoga Tantra, it focuses on absolute truth as being non-conceptual. So instead of trying to explain it, although we do, the explanation involves that it's non-conceptual, that it can't be explained in words very well. And we've already seen examples of that in the Path of the Bodhisattva, where we looked at the Buddha nature, and we looked at the middle way, and so forth, and the transcendent wisdom of the Prajnaparamita. It's beyond explanation, beyond logic, and that sort of thing. It's viewed as empty and luminous and so forth. The relative truth, on the other hand, in this one is viewed as a mandala of deities. Now, we haven't really talked about that approach before when we've talked about relative truth. But here, the relative truth emerges as this mandala of the deities and all of the other things associated with the place in which the deity abides, if you will. And so then we visualize ourselves as the deity and the actualization of the divine body, speech, and mind of the Buddha and the actions of a Buddha. So we see ourselves as the Buddha. So you can see there's kind of a gradual transition through those three stages. But interestingly enough, most of the teachings that we have received in the West do not make real clear distinctions like that. And in fact, most of them are taught based on the explanations here, of the last one, the Yoga Tantra approach. Okay? So we don't really get clear distinctions in most of the teachings at the Kriya Yoga or the Upa Yoga level. It's mostly at the Tantra Yoga level. Some common examples of outer deity yogas would be Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, Vajrasattva. We already looked at Vajrasattva as a part of our generations, or as our Nundro practice. Green Tara, White Tara would both fit into this category. Avalokiteshvara or Chenrezi fits into this category. Medicine Buddha, Amitabha, Manjushri, and so forth. They're all single, peaceful deities and so forth. So they clearly fit into this outer Tantra category. But again, most of the teachings, at least that I have received on this, and most of the things that I've read, also take the point of view of the Yoga Tantra in describing these and explaining these and so forth. One of the problems with these categories is that they were actually developed after all of these teachings, the practices were. So the things don't actually fit in the categories real well. They kind of overlap a little here, a little there, and so forth. So the categories aren't really significant anyway, other than just the broad general categories like outer and inner. are important to be aware of, but the individual subcategories within that, not so much until we get into some of the highest Yoga Tantra things where there's some categories, different sets of categories, which can also be a little bit confusing as we look at those and the differences there. But those things do happen. You get things that are a semi-wrathful deity that kind of fits a little bit into one or a little bit into the other, and so forth. One of the things that I think is important as we begin to really get into these practices of Tantra, however, is the whole reason for Tantra. Now, earlier we talked about Tantra actually emerged originally as a separate entity. It was not part of Buddhism nor Hinduism, but was absorbed into both of those. We don't really know a great deal about the history of Tantra, where it came from, how it emerged, and so forth. We just know little bits about that. We know that it was kind of a rejection of societal norms. A lot of the rules that were in the Vedas, for example, were pretty much rejected as a part of the practice of Tantra. And so there's things like that that we know. We also know that it emerged in a period of time during which the feminine was taking on increased significance in all of the religious practices of India. And so a period from about the beginning of the first millennium until maybe the 6th century, something like 7th century, was a period of growth. A lot of the deities which were very insignificant, kind of nature-type deities, all of a sudden became significant goddesses in the traditions, in both Hinduism and in Buddhism. And so we begin to see this emergence of the divine feminine as being very significant, and women tended to have a more significant impact. Now, as it moved into Buddhism, Tantra became Buddhicized, this is the word that I use for it, because Buddhism was a very monastic tradition. And so to make it work, so to speak, in that tradition, you had to modify it a little bit from the way that it was actually practiced. And in the process of doing that, what they did was turn some of the actual practices into more symbolic kinds of practices. And so today, when we look at Tantra from a Buddhist point of view, most, not all, but most of it is actually very symbolic in its form. Okay? And we'll look at that, and we'll look at both, because there are both the divisions of the monastic tradition, much of which is what we receive in the West in terms of teachings, and the yogi tradition, which continued to practice it in the actual tantric practices with an actual consort and so forth. And some of that is also done in the monastic tradition as well, kept pretty secret for the most part. They kind of redefined what it meant to be celibate in doing that. So instead of being celibate and having no sex whatsoever, it became having no orgasm during the sexual union. No orgasm during the sexual union. So, and it was typically only practiced by some of the very highest levels of the different monks in the tradition as well, and nuns. So they changed the way that it was done. But in the yogi tradition, which is the tradition that we embody, the one that we are a part of since we're not monastics, it is something that is possible for us to participate in. And so we will talk a little bit about different ways that that can be done without going too much into the detail, but at least giving you enough so you have a pretty good idea of what is done, how it's done, what's appropriate for us to do as lay practitioners and so forth. Okay? So we will get into that a little bit later. And it goes on into the advanced practices that we'll talk about in the next sessions next year. So we'll just give an introduction to it a little bit later in this part 4. And then we'll get into it more in the other parts a little bit. So, one of the things to keep in mind here is that Padmasambhava only touches a little bit on the actual deity yoga. Most of the things in the Natural Liberation textbook that we're using are really focused on completion stage kinds of practices. and hence we'll spend more time on completion stage kinds of practices. But I think it's really important to have a good foundation in generation stage practices. So I'm going to supplement some of what he provides. I think he gives a really good introduction to that, but as we get into the actual deity yoga things, he just doesn't say very much about it. He gives a couple of practices and says, here's some alternatives, and that's about all he says about it. And so we'll supplement that. We'll go into a little bit more detail about doing that, and we'll do some of those practices. But another piece to keep in mind about this is that it's just another form of shamatha. And a lot of the teachers will talk about that. Even though we call it Tantra, and we call it deity yoga and so forth, it's really a variation of shamatha. So if you recall, the first shamatha practice that we did, we started off by focusing on some small object. It could be a vajra, it could be a small pebble, is one of the things they frequently talk about. Just a small object of some type as our object of focus. He doesn't talk about it in terms of focus on our breath, which is often what is taught in the Path of Individual Liberation, but just a physical object. And so that was our first practice, and I will suggest as we move back into this, because we've diverted a bit away from that, it might be helpful to you to go back again and do some of that practice again, to reinforce that, get more familiar with it. But as we move through these next few stages, the one that we'll look at today is looking at an imaginary object. So instead of a physical object, we're going to imagine a bindu, a light, right between our eyebrows in the forehead here. Okay? So it's an imaginary object. After that, the next meeting, next class, we will look at one where a bindu is at our heart. And we are a hollow body, a step closer to deity yoga. Okay? And then you do the basic deity yoga, which is focused on just the deity. And then we go into highest yoga tantra, which involves not just the deity, but a complete mandala of various figures and so forth. So you can see what we're doing is we're taking a very simple practice, shamatha practice, and we're just going step by step to a more elaborate form of focus. Okay? And that's really all it is. But it's beautifully set out, and it's a very easy way to develop stage by stage the complexities involved in some of these advanced practices, which can take a while to master a complete mandala and what all of the pieces of the mandala are, the different figures that are involved in it, and so forth. But don't let that bother you, because there are ways, if you have trouble dealing with visualizations, there are ways of dealing with that as well. So we'll talk about alternatives to that. But that's the basic format of what we're going through in this part of the practice. And the practice that we're actually going to be doing here is, as I said, this one with an eyebrow bindu. So I'm just going to go ahead and lead into that today. We imagine this small orb of white light. If you've ever looked into a candle, or if you've ever looked at a small flashlight with just a single light, a small single light, something like that, that's the type of a light that we're talking about. It's fairly small, the size of a pea perhaps, but it's radiating out light in all directions. And we imagine it, as I mentioned, between our eyebrows. And so it's kind of like this light is just emerging out from between our eyebrows there. And we just visualize that. You can visualize it from inside, or you can visualize it from outside, or some combination of those. I like to visualize it from inside and just imagine it being there, and imagine the light coming out, radiating out from that white light. And then as we do that, then thoughts may come up, just as we talked about before in shamatha. And as they do, we just let them go and refocus our attention. The instruction is always, if something happens, refocus, refocus, refocus. Because that's what shamatha is all about. Single-pointed, calm abiding. Single pointed, that's the focus. So being able to really stay focused on an object so that even if things come up, it's not to say that we're trying to totally get rid of them. In the Shamata practices and the Path of Individual Liberation, they're trying to get rid of all thoughts. Okay? Buddhists discovered that's not an easy thing to do. Not for very long, anyway. And so they developed this other form of shamatha practice and the deity practices and so forth, which doesn't try to get rid of all thoughts, but just not be affected by them. Has the same effect. Okay? If you're not bothered by thoughts that come up, they just go away. And you just keep on. You just stay focused. Stay focused. Stay focused. And if you're having more thoughts that come up, then you try and intensify your focus a little bit. If you're getting too jittery about that, you need to relax a little bit, then you kind of let go and relax. One of the things that has helped me in doing this is to think, just relax your brain. You know, and there's almost a physical sensation that happens when you do that, that just takes some of the pressure out of your head. And it just relaxes and it makes it easier to stay focused. Now, other variations in terms of being able to do this practice, in the Path of Individual Liberation, oftentimes it's taught to practice with your eyes closed. But the Buddha really taught us to practice with our eyes open. And there's several reasons for that, but one of the reasons is that when your eyes are closed, it's easier to actually get drowsy. Okay? And so the practice as taught in the Tibetan tradition is if you start getting drowsy, raise your eyes up a little bit. And then if you start getting too much activity going on, let your eyes down a little bit. Now in the usual pose of doing meditation, we're looking down at an angle. Okay? In Dzogchen, which we'll get to later, we look straight ahead. And I've personally found, this I'll throw out as an option for you, is for me it's worked better to be able to look straight ahead. I'm much less likely to get drowsy than if my eyes are looking downward. So I like looking straight ahead, my eyes somewhat wider open than you might normally do. And that's part of the way that it's often done in Dzogchen. If you've ever seen the picture of the statue of Padmasambhava called Looks Like Me, his eyes are just really wide open, looking straight ahead. And so that's a real common way to do the practice in Dzogchen. So it's an alternative. You know, try it out, see if it works for you. If you like looking down, that's fine. But again, if you tend to start getting a lot of activity, it's better to look down. If you start getting drowsy, it's better to look up, and so forth. Okay? So a few things to help with that practice. So I wanted to read the actual description in the book. This is on page 97, if you have the book and want to read along here. Toward the bottom of the page, the indented part there. Next, so the next here is from having done the one with the small object, physical object. Place your body in the proper posture and so on like before. For your meditative object, vividly direct your attention simply without wavering to a white, radiant, clear, limpid Bindu at the point between your eyebrows. About the size of a white pea it appears, but is without an inherent nature. Gently release in clarity and joy. I think joy is a good thing here. When joy is part of your meditation, you're more likely to want to come back and do it again and again. And settle your mind in its natural state. Do not be interrupted by thoughts. Meditate just like that with many sessions of short duration as before. Now, one of the things that you can do, depending on how much time you have for meditation, is that you can do this for 5 minutes, stop, take a few deep breaths, do it for another 5 minutes, stop, take a few deep breaths, do it for another 5 minutes. You've done 15 minutes of meditation, but it will be more effective than if you try to do 15 minutes solid. Okay? Especially in the beginning. And once you've developed some practice where you can do more extended time periods, then 15 minutes becomes the short time period, and an hour becomes the longer one, and so forth. So, short duration, engage in that meditation for 3 days, or as your own experience dictates. Whatever experiences occur from time to time, examine them. So what are these experiences? Where are they coming from? Where do they go? And you remember when we were looking at the path of individual liberation, and we looked at what is the nature of self, what is the nature of other? That's the kind of practice that you do, what he's referring to here. Okay? And so that is the practice. It's as simple as that.